Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the Scriptoria of Ireland, where the only sounds are the soft scratch of quills against parchment and the faint rustle of pages in dimly lit rooms. These were not places of bustling activity, but quiet, sacred spaces tucked away in the heart of monasteries. Here, monks worked in solitude, their lives dedicated to preserving knowledge with ink and illumination. The peaceful stillness of the landscape mirrored the tranquility of these scriptoria, where each stroke of the pen was a step toward preserving history. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The scriptoria of Ireland were not like the grand, bustling workshops you might imagine if you've ever seen a medieval monastery in a movie. No, these places of writing and illumination were far quieter, tucked away in the shadowed corners of religious life. Picture a room, small and dimly lit, the only sounds being the faint scratch of quills against parchment, and the occasional murmur of a monk whispering in Latin as he carefully, painstakingly transcribed a sacred text. In the early centuries of the Christian era, Ireland was not yet the lush green land of rolling hills and lively pubs we know today. Instead, it was a place of rugged isolation, where the whispers of history were carved into stone, hidden in monasteries that served as beacons of knowledge. These monasteries were so far removed from the political intrigues and rampant warfare of the rest of Europe that they created their own peculiar, quiet world. It was here, in these remote outposts, that the Irish Scriptoria began to take form. The roots of these writing rooms stretch back to the 5th and 6th centuries, when the Irish began to embrace Christianity. But it wasn't just the arrival of the faith that made Ireland so important to the preservation of knowledge. It was how the Irish monks, with their rigorous devotion, took to the task of copying and preserving ancient texts. They were like scribes of an almost mythical order, their days spent transcribing the scriptures, copying Latin and Greek manuscripts, and even taking on the Herculean task of translating important works into the Irish language. These monks weren't just copying words. They were creating intricate works of art. The Irish Scriptoria became famous for their illuminated manuscripts, gorgeous, detailed books of scriptures, prayers, and even historical records, all painstakingly decorated with colorful, intricate designs. The work was incredibly labor-intensive. Monks would spend years on a single manuscript, and it wasn't unusual for the final product to be the work of multiple monks. One would write, another might illuminate the pages, and yet another would bind the finished book together. The setting of these scriptoria was as peaceful as it was remote. Imagine, for a moment, the landscape surrounding the monastery. On the one hand, you had the cool, misty air of the Irish countryside, where the constant drizzle kept everything lush and green. On the other hand, you had the quiet stillness of the rooms where the monks worked. The scriptoria themselves were often located in the heart of the monastery, in a space where the silence was only broken by the occasional soft rustle of parchment. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where time seemed to slow down and the world outside felt far away. As we begin to picture these scriptoria, we should also think about the monks themselves. They were not the simple, uneducated men we might imagine. In fact, they were often highly trained scholars, with a deep understanding of languages like Latin, Greek, and even Old Irish. These men were devoted to preserving and spreading knowledge, yet their lives were hardly simple. They lived in a world that was both deeply spiritual and intensely practical. Their work wasn't just about writing. It was about saving the very essence of learning and culture from the ravages of time. In many ways, the monks of Ireland were the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages. While the rest of Europe was often embroiled in warfare, political strife, or the chaos of the early medieval period, Ireland was quietly fostering a rich tradition of intellectual life. And at the heart of this tradition were the Scriptoria, where knowledge was not just copied, but protected and nurtured, almost like a sacred treasure. The importance of these Scriptoria cannot be overstated. Ireland, during these early centuries, was a cultural oasis. As the rest of Europe stumbled through the so-called Dark Ages, it was in Ireland that many of the texts of the ancient world were preserved. Greek and Latin manuscripts that would have otherwise been lost to history found their way into the hands of Irish monks, who carefully copied them. This meant that when Europe finally emerged from the fog of the early medieval period, it had something to lean on: the preserved knowledge of the ancients, preserved by a small group of scholars in a far corner of the world. One of the most famous examples of these efforts is the Book of Kells, one of the most exquisite illuminated manuscripts ever created. The Book of Kells, a dazzling example of Irish scriptorial craftsmanship, is a testament to the skill and patience of the monks who created it. Its pages are covered in intricate Celtic designs, with each letter and illustration as meticulously placed as the stitches in a tapestry. It is, in many ways, the epitome of the Irish Scriptoria, a marriage of faith, art, and intellectual preservation. But the Book of Kells isn't the only treasure to have emerged from the Irish Scriptoria. The Irish were also known for creating a special kind of script, the insular script, which was a distinct, rounded form of handwriting that would be used in manuscripts for centuries to come. It was this script, along with the detailed illustrations, that helped give Irish manuscripts a unique place in history. The work of these monks wasn't just functional, it was beautiful, intricate, and filled with meaning. What makes the Irish Scriptoria even more fascinating is how they stood in contrast to the rest of Europe. While places like Rome and Byzantium were busy with their own versions of intellectual life, the Irish had their own way of doing things. They were isolated, yes, but they were also incredibly independent. They didn't rely on the great cities of the time for their intellectual and spiritual nourishment. Instead, they created their own world, where the preservation of knowledge wasn't a matter of political necessity or power. It was a matter of faith, devotion, and an understanding that what they were doing would be remembered for centuries. Now, as we picture these monks hunched over their scrolls and books, their ink-stained fingers working diligently under the flickering light of a candle, it's worth considering the environment they were working in. These scriptoria were not places of luxury. In fact, they were quite humble, with rough stone walls and sparse furnishings. A scriptoria might have had little more than a few desks, some ink pots, and a few simple tools, but that didn't make the work any less significant. In fact, the simplicity of the surroundings only added to the sense of devotion. These were not rooms of extravagance, but of purpose, rooms where the monks spent years crafting something that would outlast them by centuries. In the next parts, we will continue our journey into the Scriptoria of Ireland, delving deeper into the lives of the monks who worked there, the challenges they faced, and the manuscripts they left behind. These Scriptoria were quiet, sacred places that held more than just words and ink. They held the keys to understanding a world long past. As we drift deeper into the workings of these ancient Scriptoria, we find that the monks who labored within them were not simply isolated figures hunched over dusty scrolls. These men, who seemed to live lives steeped in silence and solitude, were in fact part of a complex web of monastic life, one that blended prayer, work, and scholarly endeavor in a delicate balance. For all the peaceful solitude of the Scriptoria, these monks lived in a world of constant activity. where the boundaries between sacred devotion and scholarly pursuit were often blurred. In these remote monasteries, time was structured around the rhythm of the liturgical hours. The day began with the early morning prayer, often before the first light of dawn had broken through the heavy clouds. From there, the monks would move from one prayer to another, punctuating the hours with chants, hymns, and recitations of sacred texts. And in between, in the small windows of free time, they would turn to their work in the scriptorium. But don't imagine these monks as mere scribes, mechanically copying down texts. No, their work was a deeply spiritual act. For the medieval Christian, copying sacred texts was not just about replicating words on a page. It was an act of worship. Each letter, each word, was viewed as imbued with divine significance. To copy the scriptures was to participate in something eternal, something far greater than the mundane world around them. It was said that a monk who transcribed a single page of a manuscript could expect to be rewarded with the same spiritual benefits as one who had spent hours in prayer. This sacred task wasn't as simple as jotting down words in a script. It involved a careful, deliberate process. First, the parchment would have to be prepared. This was no small feat. The skin of sheep or goats, after being cleaned and scraped, was stretched and dried, ready to be transformed into a blank canvas for the words of God. The monks would then mark out the lines on the parchment with precise measurements, ensuring that every text was written with a clarity and balance that would make reading it a meditative experience. Next came the ink, black, thick and rich, made from a combination of soot, gum, and water. The ink would be carefully mixed in small pots, and the monks would dip their quills into the ink, which was usually made from feathers or reeds, and begin their work. The quills, held at just the right angle, would glide across the page with surprising smoothness, considering the humble tools used. Every stroke was calculated, intentional. This wasn't just about speed, it was about beauty, order, and precision. For the monks, the Scriptoria were places of deep mental and spiritual concentration. While one monk would be busy writing, another might be illuminating the manuscript. Illumination was a delicate art, and one that added a layer of beauty and complexity to these texts. The monks would create intricate designs, interwoven patterns of knots, swirls, and spirals that were symbolic of the infinite nature of God's creation. These patterns weren't random, they were designed to mirror the divine order of the universe, bringing the sacred word to life in vibrant, colorful detail. The illumination process was as time-consuming as it was intricate. First, the monk would sketch out the design lightly, in pencil, working from a book of patterns. Then, using gold leaf and brightly colored paints made from minerals and plant materials, he would begin to fill in the design. The gold leaf, which caught the light and shimmered, was often used for initial letters or decorative flourishes. It was meant to evoke a sense of the divine, to make the text not just a book, but a living, breathing artifact, filled with light and grace. But the work wasn't without its frustrations. Writing in the Scriptoria was a slow and often grueling process. Imagine spending hours, sometimes days, on a single page. The work could be painstakingly dull, with little external reward or recognition. Errors could be costly, especially in the delicate art of illumination. If a monk made a mistake, he would have to carefully scrape away the ink or paint and start again. Some monks would even cut entire sections out and start anew. And yet, there was a strange joy in the process, an unspoken satisfaction in seeing the manuscript grow, one letter at a time. Even the act of copying texts wasn't without its own set of challenges. The monks were not merely copying words from one manuscript to another. They were often working with older, sometimes deteriorating texts. The process of transcribing was a bit like restoring a fragile piece of artwork. The monks would need to decipher fading letters, interpreting what had once been clearly written, but now was unclear due to age. Sometimes the work was so worn that a single letter could only be guessed at. It was up to the monk to know what the word should be, based on context, memory, and sometimes divine inspiration. This was, in some ways, a deeply intellectual pursuit. The monks were scholars. After all, they had to have a deep understanding of not just the sacred text they were copying, but also of languages, grammar, and structure. Latin, Greek, and Old Irish were all used in the Scriptoria, and the monks had to be fluent in these languages to ensure that the manuscripts were faithfully copied. They had to be able to read the works of the Church Fathers, the early philosophers, and the ancient poets. They were, in essence, preserving not just religious knowledge, but the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. The monasteries were often self-sustaining. While the monks were busy in the scriptorium, other brothers would tend to the crops, tend to the livestock, and manage the day-to-day needs of the community. But there were also times when the monks would travel to other monasteries to exchange knowledge, to discuss the theological and philosophical ideas that would help shape the Christian world. These journeys were vital for the spread of ideas and texts throughout Ireland and beyond. Through these exchanges, the Scriptoria became a nexus of intellectual life, not just in Ireland, but in much of early medieval Europe. These Scriptoria weren't merely spaces for writing, though they were sacred spaces, where the act of writing and the act of worship intertwined. There is something profoundly moving about the idea of these monks, isolated from the chaos of the world, working in the quiet of their Scriptoria, creating books that would become treasures for centuries to come. In a world that often seemed far from the divine, the Scriptoria were small islands of focus and devotion, where the sacred was brought to life in ink and illumination. As we continue our quiet journey through the Scriptoria, the true importance of these humble rooms becomes more and more apparent. These places were not just centers of monastic life or mere workshops for transcribing text. They were, in fact, some of the most crucial repositories of knowledge in a world that seemed to be losing it at every turn. The monks, who labored within these walls, weren't just creating beautiful works of art. They were preserving the very foundation of learning itself, much of it drawn from ancient classical sources that would have otherwise slipped into oblivion. To understand the significance of the Scriptoria, it helps to consider the world outside these walls. At the time, much of Europe was living through what we now call the Dark Age. While the Irish monks were meticulously copying ancient manuscripts, the rest of Europe was experiencing a kind of intellectual stagnation. Rome had fallen, and much of the infrastructure of the classical world had crumbled. Libraries had burned, and the centralization of knowledge was lost as the chaos of war, invasion, and political upheaval engulfed the continent. During these centuries, intellectual life in Europe was fragmented, and many of the ancient Greek and Roman texts, whether philosophical, scientific, or literary, were being lost to time. But in Ireland, the Scriptoria held firm, quietly saving what was at risk of being forgotten. This wasn't merely a matter of preserving Christian texts, although that was certainly a significant part of the work. The monks of Ireland were also copying works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, the very texts that had formed the intellectual backbone of the Roman Empire. Think of the works of Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and Virgil, texts that might have disappeared entirely if not for the efforts of the Irish monks. These manuscripts, copied with painstaking care in Scriptoria all across Ireland, would go on to shape the intellectual revival that would sweep through Europe in the later Middle Ages and beyond. It's important to note that these works weren't just being copied verbatim. Often, the monks would engage with the texts on a deeper level, interpreting them, annotating them, and sometimes even adapting them to fit the religious worldview of the time. In this way, the Scriptoria were not just sites of passive reproduction. The monks were, in a sense, translating the knowledge of the ancients into a Christian context, making these classical works compatible with the new faith that had taken hold in Europe. The ideas of Aristotle or Plato weren't being rejected, rather they were being absorbed and integrated into Christian thought, often with commentary that made the works relevant to the religious and philosophical issues of the day. One of the most famous manuscripts to emerge from an Irish scriptorium is the Book of Durrow, a beautifully illuminated gospel book that is one of the earliest examples of the insular style of manuscript illumination. The Book of Durrow is not only important for its religious significance, but also for its artistry. The intricate designs, the delicate interlace patterns, and the vibrant use of color all point to the Irish monks' ability to blend devotion with artistry. What's remarkable about this book is that it was created at a time when books were still a rare and precious commodity. The labor involved in its creation would have been enormous, requiring not only a skilled scribe but also an artist to paint the elaborate illustrations that accompany the text. The Book of Durrow is a testament to the level of dedication these monks had to their craft, and it's one of the earliest signs of the flourishing of Irish manuscript culture. The Book of Kells, however, is the undisputed star of Irish manuscript production. This stunningly illuminated gospel book, likely produced in the early 9th century, is considered one of the most magnificent manuscripts of the Middle Ages. The Book of Kells was not just a gospel book. It was a veritable treasure trove of artistic and intellectual achievement. Its pages are filled with intricate, vibrant illustrations, gold leaf, and vibrant colors that bring the text to life in a way few other manuscripts could. The Book of Kells is a masterpiece of the insular style, combining Christian imagery with Celtic designs, and its creation would have been the work of multiple generations of monks, each contributing their unique skills. But the Book of Kells is just one example. The Irish Scriptoria were producing manuscripts at a staggering rate, and many of them were not just religious texts, but also works of history, law, and philosophy. Take, for instance, the Book of Armagh, which contains a collection of religious texts, as well as an important historical record of the early Irish Church. This manuscript is significant not just for its content, but for its historical value. It includes the earliest surviving version of the Annals of Ulster, a crucial source for understanding the history of Ireland during the early medieval period. The Book of Armagh is a reminder that the Irish monks were not just concerned with copying religious texts. They were also deeply invested in preserving their own history. The Liber Gabale, another important manuscript produced in Ireland, is a medieval text that attempts to compile the mythological and historical origins of the Irish people. This work, often referred to as the Book of Invasions, is filled with tales of gods, kings, and legendary battles. Though it's a work of mythology, it also reflects the efforts of the Irish monks to preserve their own unique cultural identity during a time when much of the ancient world's history was slipping away. In this way, the Scriptoria weren't just sites of religious worship, they were places of cultural and national preservation. As we explore these manuscripts, we also begin to appreciate the incredible value of the Scriptoria as places of intellectual exchange. While the monks worked in isolation, they were part of a larger network of monastic communities. Manuscripts were exchanged between monasteries, and ideas were shared, not just within Ireland, but throughout Europe. The Scriptoria, in a sense, became the hubs of learning, where texts could be copied, preserved, and disseminated to a wider audience. Through these exchanges, the intellectual life of Europe slowly began to rebuild itself, thanks to the quiet work of Irish monks. But even as they preserved the classical world's knowledge, the monks also brought their own intellectual innovations to the table. The Irish were among the first to develop a system of dating that would later influence the Western calendar. They were also pioneers in the field of mathematics, astronomy, and liturgy, incorporating these elements into their manuscripts and their religious practices. The Scriptoria were not just preserving the past, they were shaping the future. As the centuries passed, the quiet, isolated world of the Irish Scriptoria began to shift. The influence of these monasteries and their work continued to spread throughout Europe, but the environment in which the Scriptoria thrived started to change. The peaceful monastic world that had so carefully preserved the treasures of the ancient world began to feel the tremors of outside forces, political upheaval, Viking invasions, and the shifting tides of power. The Viking raids, which began in the late 8th century, were among the first significant challenges to the Scriptoria of Ireland. These raids weren't just a matter of pillaging and violence. They were aimed at the very heart of Ireland's intellectual life. The Vikings, known for their raids on monasteries and their thirst for treasure, attacked the monasteries, looting their libraries and burning their buildings. These attacks would devastate many of the most famous Scriptoria, including those at Lindisfarne and Kells, were targeted and precious manuscripts were lost to the flames. But even in the face of these attacks, the Irish monks didn't abandon their work. They continued to produce manuscripts, often hiding them away in secret places to protect them from the ravages of time and war. There are stories of monks taking their books to remote islands off the coast of Ireland, where they would continue their work in relative safety. The monks were not just guardians of knowledge, they were its defenders, willing to risk everything to protect the written word. Despite these efforts, the Viking raids and the political instability of the period took their toll on the Scriptoria. By the 12th century, the golden age of the Irish manuscript tradition was starting to fade. The political landscape of Ireland was changing, and the monasteries, once so independent, began to face increasing pressure from the outside. The influence of the Church in Rome grew stronger, and the monasteries became more closely aligned with papal authority, which altered the way they operated. The age of the independent Irish Scriptoria, with their focus on preserving knowledge and culture, was gradually replaced by a more centralized, standardized religious system. It wasn't just the Vikings or the political shifts that contributed to the decline of the Scriptoria. By the time of the High Middle Ages, the production of manuscripts was becoming more industrialized. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, would eventually render the painstaking work of hand-copying manuscripts obsolete. The rise of printed books, which could be produced in large quantities and distributed quickly, began to eclipse the work of the Irish monks. The Scriptoria, once the heart of intellectual life, became a relic of a bygone era. Still, the legacy of the Irish Scriptoria endured. The manuscripts they produced, the Book of Kells, the Book of Armagh, the Book of Doro, and so many others, are among the most treasured artifacts of the medieval world. These works represent not only the intellectual achievements of the Irish monks, but also their devotion, their commitment to preserving knowledge in the face of chaos, and their ability to create beauty in the midst of hardship. The influence of the Scriptoria didn't stop with the fall of the monasteries. The intellectual traditions they upheld would go on to shape the development of European scholarship in the centuries that followed. When the Renaissance came, many of the classical texts that had been preserved in the Irish monasteries found their way back into the hands of scholars across Europe. The Irish Scriptoria, which had quietly saved these works from the Dark Ages, had laid the groundwork for the intellectual flourishing of the Renaissance. Today, we still marvel at the beauty and significance of the manuscripts produced in the Irish Scriptoria. The Book of Kells, with its vibrant colours and intricate designs, continues to inspire awe and admiration. It serves as a reminder of the incredible skill and devotion of the monks who created it. These manuscripts are more than just books. They are windows into a world long gone, a world where faith and intellect were intertwined, and where knowledge was preserved in the most fragile and beautiful of forms. Even in the modern world, the Scriptoria's legacy lives on in the work of scholars, historians, and artists who continue to study and restore these manuscripts. The techniques of illumination, the artistry of the calligraphy, and the methods of manuscript production are still of great interest to those who study medieval art and history. The Irish Scriptoria, through their manuscripts, have left an indelible mark on the world, one that continues to shape our understanding of the past and our appreciation for the preservation of knowledge. And while the Scriptoria may have faded into history, their quiet labor lives on. The monks who once sat for hours in dimly lit rooms, copying sacred texts and creating masterpieces of art, may no longer be with us, but their work has outlived them. The world of the Irish Scriptoria was one of quiet devotion, where each letter and each illustration was a small act of preservation, a small act of defiance against the ravages of time. And in that small act, they managed to save not just words, but the essence of a world that might otherwise have been lost forever. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through the quiet world of the Irish Scriptoria, it becomes clear that the legacy of these humble runes of ink and illumination is far more profound than we might initially expect. What began as a series of small, isolated efforts to preserve the sacred and the scholarly grew into a foundation upon which much of European intellectual life was rebuilt. By the time the 15th century arrived, the invention of the printing press heralded the end of the era of handwritten manuscripts. The mass production of books which the press enabled made the painstaking work of copying manuscripts seem like a distant memory. The world of the Scriptoria, once the center of all literary and intellectual activity, began to fade as printed books flooded the market. But while the press might have rendered the Scriptoria obsolete in a practical sense, it did not diminish the significance of what these monks had accomplished. In fact, the survival of classical knowledge, facilitated by their efforts, became a cornerstone for the rise of humanism and the Renaissance. Think of it this way. Without the Irish Scriptoria, the intellectual revival that sparked the Renaissance might have been significantly delayed. While other parts of Europe struggled to preserve ancient knowledge, the Irish had already safeguarded so much of the classical legacy. The ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been transcribed with such care by the monks were some of the very works that would shape the minds of scholars like Petrarch, Erasmus, and Leonardo da Vinci. These scholars relied on the texts that had been carefully preserved and transmitted from the distant islands of Ireland, where monks had spent lifetimes copying and illuminating the works of the past. The manuscripts themselves are perhaps the most lasting testimony to the work done in these Scriptoria. Today, these texts, housed in libraries and museums around the world, continue to be treasured not just for their content, but for their beauty and artistry. The intricate designs, the vibrant colors, and the skillful calligraphy that adorn the pages of books like the Book of Kells and the Book of Dura are still awe-inspiring. These manuscripts aren't just religious texts or historical records. They are works of art in their own right, a blend of devotion, creativity, and intellectual pursuit. But the impact of the Scriptoria is not just confined to the past. In a world that is often preoccupied with the speed of information and the convenience of digital media, There is something profoundly calming about the idea of the Scriptoria. The work done in these rooms, quiet, meticulous, and often slow, serves as a reminder of the value of patience and attention to detail. In an age where everything moves at breakneck speed, the Scriptoria offer a contrast, a place where knowledge was preserved through careful, deliberate action. Perhaps in that way, the Scriptoria can still teach us something today, that true preservation, whether of knowledge, beauty, or culture, often requires slow, steady work. Even more remarkably, the Scriptoria and their work have had an enduring influence on modern scholarship. In the centuries following the rise of printing, the study of ancient texts continued, driven in part by the manuscripts that the Irish monks had so carefully preserved. The study of Latin, Greek, and Old Irish, for example, would be crucial to the development of philology and classical studies. These areas of scholarship would go on to shape the academic world, influencing everything from linguistics to philosophy to theology. The story of the Irish Scriptoria is also a reminder of the enduring power of faith and devotion. In an era when much of the world was torn apart by war, invasions, and political instability, these monks remained committed to their work. They believed that their labor, no matter how small or insignificant it might have seemed, was part of something greater, a divine task to preserve knowledge for future generations. And so, despite the many challenges they faced, the monks of the Scriptoria kept working. They copied, illuminated, and bound their manuscripts with the understanding that their work would be a gift for those who came after them. Perhaps this is the most remarkable aspect of the Scriptoria. The monks knew that their efforts would not be fully appreciated in their own time. They were not creating works that would bring them fame or wealth. They were working in the shadows, knowing that the true value of their labor would be realized only much later, when their manuscripts would be discovered, cherished, and preserved by future generations. In many ways, their work was a silent act of faith, a belief that the world would one day recognize the value of what they had created. In the end, the Irish Scriptoria offer a quiet, humble, and yet incredibly powerful testament to the enduring value of intellectual and artistic preservation. Their story is one of devotion, patience, and perseverance in the face of adversity. The monks who worked in these rooms, in their quiet, uncelebrated way, played a crucial role in shaping the world we know today. Through their efforts, they ensured that the knowledge of the ancients would not be lost. Through their artistry, they created works that continue to inspire awe. And through their dedication, they gave us something that transcends time, the written word, preserved in its most beautiful and thoughtful form. As we reflect on the world of the Irish Scriptoria, we can't help but marvel at what these monks achieved. They lived in a time of chaos and uncertainty, yet they managed to build something lasting. And though their Scriptoria may have disappeared with the passage of time, their work lives on, quietly, beautifully, and forever etched in ink and illumination. Like a page turned, the last story fades, but the book is far from finished. Another chapter is waiting just ahead, its words sharper, its truths heavier, its presence impossible to ignore. This, the water gardens of Moorish Spain, pools, fountains, and paradise. The ancient Moors, who arrived on the Iberian Peninsula in the early 8th century, brought with them not just their religion and culture, but also a deep reverence for water. In a land where arid, sun-baked earth dominated much of the landscape, water was a rare and precious gift, one that was revered, almost worshipped. The Moors understood this, and they mastered the art of harnessing water in ways that transformed dry, barren spaces into lush paradises. From the moment they arrived, the Moors began to reshape the environment of the Iberian Peninsula. They built intricate irrigation systems, stretching far across the land, allowing agriculture to flourish in places where it had once been impossible. But they didn't stop there. Water was also woven into the very fabric of their palaces and gardens. They weren't just interested in practicality. They sought to create serene, peaceful spaces where the sound of flowing water could soothe the soul, where one could sit by a pool watching the fountains dance and feel the calm seep into their bones. The Moorish water gardens, often referred to as paradises, were designed to be retreats for the senses, a tranquil escape from the outside world. In cities like Cordoba, Granada, and Seville, the Moors cultivated lush, luxurious gardens filled with water features, fountains, and pools that invited contemplation and relaxation. These gardens were not just about beauty, though. They were symbols of power, wealth, and a mastery over nature. The water gardens were places where the ruling elite could display their taste, sophistication, and connection to the divine. One of the most famous examples of Moorish water gardens is the Alhambra, the Grand Palace complex in Granada. Here, the Moors created an extraordinary series of interlinked pools and fountains, each designed to invoke the tranquility of paradise itself. The layout of the Alhambra's gardens was a careful study in balance and symmetry. The pools and fountains were designed not only to be visually stunning, but to create a sense of harmony, where water could flow in a controlled, predictable manner, creating a peaceful, meditative environment. The Alhambra's general life gardens, just outside the palace walls, offer another stunning example of Moorish landscaping. This series of terraced gardens was designed to make the most of the water available, using gravity-fed systems to channel water from a nearby river into fountains, pools, and irrigation channels. The water cascaded down through the terraces, creating a constant, soothing sound that filled the air with a sense of calm. The pools, with their perfect reflections, mirrored the skies above, enhancing the sense of harmony between the natural world and the architecture of the palace. While these water gardens were certainly impressive feats of engineering and design, they were also deeply symbolic. Water, in the Islamic world, was often associated with life, purity, and the divine. The lush, verdant gardens of Moorish Spain were meant to be a microcosm of paradise itself, a paradise on earth, a place where the faithful could retreat and feel closer to God. The use of water in these gardens was not just about aesthetics or luxury, but about creating a space that evoked the idea of heaven, where everything flowed in perfect harmony. At the heart of these gardens was the fountain, an element that was as functional as it was symbolic. Fountains were often designed to create the illusion of endless water, a continuous flow that seemed to come from nowhere and lead to nowhere, suggesting the eternal nature of life and the divine. The water in these fountains was often channeled through intricate stone carvings, creating patterns that were both beautiful and meaningful. The sound of the water was in many ways the most important part of the design, a gentle, constant murmur that could wash away the worries of the day. The use of water was not limited to the gardens themselves. Many of the grand palaces built by the Moors, including the Alhambra and the Great Mosque of Cordoba, were designed with pools, fountains, and reflecting ponds. These water features served not only as decoration, but also as a way to create a sense of space and openness, making the interior of the palaces feel larger and more inviting. The play of light on the water, especially in the early morning or late afternoon, created a sense of movement and life, enhancing the sense of tranquility and beauty. The importance of water in the gardens of Moorish Spain also reflected a cultural and religious connection to the natural world. The gardens were often seen as a metaphor for paradise, with water representing the divine flow of life. In the Quran, paradise is described as a lush garden, watered by rivers of milk, honey, and pure water. By creating these gardens, the Moors were, in a sense, recreating a piece of heaven on earth, a place where one could feel the presence of God in the rustling of the leaves, the sound of the water, and the scent of the flowers. But the Moors were not the only ones to influence the design of these gardens. The influence of Persian and Arab traditions of garden design can be seen in the use of water features in Moorish Spain. The Persians in particular were known for their mastery of water engineering, and their influence can be seen in the terraced gardens and the use of water to create a sense of order and symmetry. The Arab world, too, had a long tradition of using water to create lush, tranquil spaces, and this influence made its way into the design of gardens in Spain. Despite the passing of centuries, many of the water gardens created by the Moors have survived, and their legacy endures. The Alhambra, with its iconic fountains and reflecting pools, remains one of the most visited tourist destinations in the world, drawing millions of people each year who come to marvel at the beauty and tranquility of its gardens. The influence of the Moorish water gardens can also be seen in other parts of the world, particularly in places like Morocco, where gardens continue to be designed with a deep reverence for water. As we move through time, it's worth noting how these water gardens were not only functional, but also a way for the ruling elite to show off their sophistication. Imagine it, royals, perhaps feeling a little smug about their control over this life-giving resource, retreating into these lush, carefully curated spaces to relax, or perhaps plot their next political maneuver, while the soft sound of cascading water whispered in the background. But behind the beauty of it all, there was an awareness of power and privilege, the very essence of those who could afford to live in such paradisiacal surroundings. As we float away from the technicalities of design and symbolism, let's take a more relaxed stroll through the lives of the rulers who lived amidst the water gardens. Their experiences weren't just about enjoying the beauty of the gardens or the trickling of fountains. These spaces, lush with greenery and trickling water, were intimate realms of personal retreat, political power, and at times public performance. The water was the backdrop to courtly life, where the ruling elite of Moorish Spain used the gardens to flex their wealth, control, and even their ability to navigate the complex dynamics of power and influence. Picture it: the cool air of the early evening, the sound of water from distant fountains carrying through the breeze, as a caliph or emir strolls through the corridors of their palace garden, taking a moment away from the pressing business of rule. In these gardens, where the lavish beauty of nature mingled with the human-made, rulers could escape from the noise of politics. Yet at the same time, the gardens were far from being purely private spaces. These were also places for political gatherings, meetings, and a carefully curated display of luxury. The gardens were as much about projecting power and influence as they were about creating a personal oasis of tranquility. In a way, the gardens mirrored the complexity of the society that the Moors built. In Moorish Spain, the relationship between ruler and subject, courtier and craftsman, was ever-present. Water, so carefully controlled, became a symbol of the ruler's ability to harness nature and bend it to their will. It was a reflection of the caliph's power, not just over land and people, but over the very elements themselves. And as rulers often did, they surrounded themselves with these symbols of control, which in turn enhanced their reputation and reinforced their authority. What better way to display power than through the endless, unyielding flow of water? But life in the courts wasn't always as serene as those glistening fountains suggested. The palaces were also centers of intrigue and complexity, places where rivalries and ambitions bubbled up, just as easily as the waters of the fountain. The intrigue was no less than a delicate dance around the influence of the monarchs, their families, and their courtiers. Imagine the drama that might have unfolded against the backdrop of these lush gardens. Whispered conversations held beside the tranquil pools, decisions about alliances, or betrayals decided in the quiet of shaded paths. Water, once again, had a subtle, almost unspoken role to play in these scenarios. It was present in the background, serene and constant, while the politics within these walls were anything but. The emirs and caliphs who ruled from their magnificent palaces were often surrounded by advisors, dignitaries, and soldiers. The gardens, with their carefully constructed water features, offered a perfect stage for these men, and occasionally women, to conduct business. They'd gather for meetings, sometimes in the open air of the garden, other times in the sheltered privacy of an enclosed space within the palace. Here, behind the delicate curtains of water trickling from elaborate fountains, power plays and delicate negotiations would unfold. The beauty of the surroundings likely helped to smooth the edges of tense exchanges, offering a serene counterpoint to the machinations of court life. After all, who could feel too aggressive, too brazen, when surrounded by the calm trickle of water? These gardens weren't simply for the rulers themselves. They also hosted visitors, ambassadors, and travelers. The gardens were as much about presenting an image of stability and prosperity as they were about creating a space for leisure. In the eyes of the outside world, the grandeur of these gardens was a reflection of the might of Moorish Spain. The wealth, the sophistication, the grasp over nature, all were on display. When foreign dignitaries came to the courts, the gardens would likely have been one of the first things they saw. They were treated to more than just a pretty sight. The gardens served as a visual declaration of power and an opportunity to flaunt the expertise of the empire's engineers and architects. Interestingly, the role of women in these gardens is also worth noting. While the palaces and gardens were primarily the domain of male rulers, these lush spaces were often deeply tied to the lives of royal women as well. The women of the royal harem were often secluded in the private quarters of the palace, but even in this seclusion, they were not entirely removed from the gardens. In fact, the gardens served as a sort of retreat, a space where they could escape the confines of the palace's more private rooms. The presence of water in these gardens was a comfort, providing a quiet refuge for women who lived under the watchful eyes of the rulers and their court. The sound of water, cascading in fountains or flowing gently through channels, must have offered a sense of freedom in an otherwise controlled and confined existence. The gardens were places of personal pleasure and, at times, subtle rebellion. It was here that women might have found moments of peace, away from the weight of royal expectations. It's fascinating to think how the gardens, so often seen as a luxury or symbol of power, could also serve as spaces of personal autonomy, if only in small, fleeting ways. Of course, not all the use of water in these gardens was purely practical or symbolic. There was, as in all great courts, an element of spectacle. The sight of these gardens, with their elaborate fountains and water features, was a performance in itself. The water, after all, had to be carefully managed. Complex systems of aqueducts, channels, and cisterns were employed to make sure that water could be brought from distant sources, often miles away, to feed the gardens. The Moors, great engineers and mathematicians, designed systems that were far ahead of their time. Water would flow seamlessly, appearing to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, an illusion of abundance that would never fail to impress visitors. This spectacular use of water became a visual metaphor for the Moors' command over their environment. For a visitor, the sheer scale of the effort required to create these gardens would have been enough to leave an impression of the ruler's power. Water flowing freely and constantly, was proof of the authority that the ruling elite possessed, not just over their land, but over the very elements that sustained life itself. But it's not just the grandeur of these gardens that deserves attention. There's a quiet dignity to them too. Behind the fountains and pools, behind the carefully arranged paths and lawns, was the idea that these spaces could serve as havens of rest and reflection in a world where political strife was often just below the surface. These gardens offered solace. The tranquility of the water flowing endlessly could for a moment ease the pressures of ruling a vast and complex empire. As the rulers and their families strolled through the gardens, perhaps they too were reminded, in those small moments, of the simple power of peace. As time drifted forward, the influence of the Moorish water gardens spread beyond the borders of Spain, leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the ages. The beauty and functionality of these gardens, which had been perfected by the rulers of Al-Andalus, would inspire countless generations to come. In fact, the water gardens of the Moors would go on to shape the design of gardens across Europe, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. After the Christian Reconquista, which gradually pushed the Moors out of Spain over several centuries, the intricate art of water management and garden design did not disappear. Instead, it became absorbed and adapted by the new rulers, who, while often eager to assert their own power and influence, could not ignore the genius of the Islamic gardens that had been left behind. These gardens were far more than a reminder of the power of a now fallen empire. They were tangible pieces of an intellectual and artistic tradition that had long-lasting appeal. Perhaps one of the most important ways the legacy of Moorish water gardens endured was through the expansion of European garden design. The principles of symmetry, order, and the use of water as both a decorative and functional feature began to take hold. Royal courts, particularly in Spain and Italy, became inspired by the intricate use of water to shape the landscape. The Royal Alcazar of Seville, a notable fortress palace complex that dates back to the 10th century, is a perfect example of this influence. Over the centuries, various Christian monarchs made significant alterations to the gardens of the Alcazar, incorporating water features that closely resembled the grand designs of their Moorish predecessors. The use of water in garden design reached its zenith during the Renaissance, with gardens like those of the Villa d'Este in Italy, which, though not directly connected to Moorish Spain, bore many similarities to the Andalusian water gardens. The cascading fountains, the reflecting pools, the careful manipulation of water, these were all elements that had been pioneered by the Moors and were carried forward by European designers who saw their beauty and utility. These gardens, just like those in Al-Andalus, became a place where the elite could retreat and experience the serenity of flowing water, often surrounded by the grandeur of classical architecture. Water's symbolic connection to paradise also continued to be important in these new gardens. The idea that gardens with their lush greenery and abundant water could replicate a divine space was still very much alive. In fact, the Renaissance gardens, inspired by the Moorish tradition, were often designed to be places where the human soul could experience a taste of heaven on earth. In a way, these gardens served as a visual representation of human aspirations, an attempt to create a perfect space where one could step away from the world's chaos and find peace, much as the Moors had envisioned in their own royal retreats. Beyond the royal courts of Europe, the influence of Moorish water gardens reached far into the Middle East, where their designs were embraced and adapted by the Ottoman Empire. In cities like Istanbul, the Ottomans took inspiration from the gardens of Al-Andalus, incorporating flowing water and symmetrical designs into their own architectural masterpieces. The Topkapi Palace, with its intricate courtyards and tranquil pools, draws heavily on the traditions established by the Moors in Spain. The Ottomans, like the Moors before them, understood the profound impact that water could have on a space, using it to evoke a sense of calm and beauty, while also demonstrating their own mastery over the natural world. In North Africa, too, the legacy of Moorish garden design continued to thrive. Cities like Marrakesh, with its iconic Majorella garden, maintain the influence of Moorish-style water gardens to this day. The use of fountains, pools, and channels in these gardens reflects the continuing admiration for the engineering and aesthetic principles introduced by the Moors. These gardens, while distinctly North African, carry with them the echoes of a tradition that began on the Iberian Peninsula, a tradition that combined artistry, function, and spirituality in perfect harmony. Interestingly, the influence of these gardens hasn't been confined to the royal or elite circles. As the centuries passed, the knowledge of how to create beautiful water features and irrigate gardens spread to other parts of society. While the grandest examples of Moorish water gardens may have been reserved for royalty, many of their principles were passed down to the general populace. In places like Granada, where the legacy of the Alhambra continues to shape the landscape, the influence of these gardens can still be seen in public spaces. The gardens may no longer be as grand, but the love for water, beauty, and tranquility remain. And in the modern era, the importance of these water gardens hasn't waned. There's something timeless about the gentle sound of water, the symmetry of well-planned gardens, and the calm they inspire. Public gardens and parks around the world still make use of fountains and reflecting pools, often drawing directly from the principles established in the gardens of Moorish Spain. For example, the famous fountains of Versailles in France, with their grand scale and symmetrical design, owe much to the lessons learned from Moorish gardens. The appeal of these spaces isn't just in their beauty, it's in the atmosphere they create. The water is ever present, steady, and constant, creating a feeling of peace that's hard to ignore. It's this tranquility that continues to attract people to these gardens. Whether in the heart of a bustling city or the remote corners of history, the legacy of the Moors, in their ability to transform ordinary landscapes into serene havens, lives on in the peaceful gardens that adorn cities, palaces, and public spaces all over the world. Of course, modern technologies have made the creation of these types of water features easier, but it's worth remembering that the original designs were born out of necessity and ingenuity. The Moors were pioneers in water management, designing aqueducts, cisterns, and channels that carried water over long distances, sometimes from miles away. The fact that they could create such lush, verdant gardens in an arid land speaks to their engineering prowess and their deep understanding of the natural world. Their gardens were not just about luxury, they were a testament to human creativity and the desire to live in harmony with nature. In a way, the survival of these gardens, their principles, and their influence speaks to the timelessness of the ideas they embodied. The Moors understood something that we continue to appreciate today, that water, with all its life-giving power, is also a force for beauty, tranquility, and inspiration. The sound of water, whether in the form of a fountain, a reflecting pool, or a quiet stream, remains a balm for the soul. And it's in these gardens, those of the Moors, and those that came after, that we can still find a little piece of paradise. As the centuries passed, the once glorious water gardens of Moorish Spain began to lose their luster. Following the Reconquista, when Christian forces gradually reclaimed the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors, many of these beautiful gardens fell into neglect. The Christian rulers who took over the territories had their own architectural tastes and priorities, often overlooking or repurposing the delicate and intricate features the Moors had crafted. Over time, the gardens that once symbolized the height of luxury and sophistication began to decay, abandoned to the ravages of time and changing political fortunes. This decline didn't happen overnight. Of course, the end of Muslim rule in Spain didn't mean an immediate halt to the enjoyment of the gardens. In fact, some of the Moorish gardens, particularly in places like Granada, continued to be maintained or modified by Christian rulers. However, as new dynasties rose and fell, priorities shifted. The delicate art of water management, once a point of pride for the Moors, was often set aside in favor of more practical pursuits or new architectural trends. Over time, many of the water systems began to fail. The once pristine pools turned stagnant, and fountains ceased their delicate dance. In the Alhambra, which had once been a shimmering jewel of Moorish architecture and design, the gardens fell into disrepair. The complex system of water channels that had fed the fountains and pools began to erode, and many of the water features ceased to function as they had under the Moors. The beautiful courtyards, once filled with the sound of flowing water and the scent of flowers, became quiet and still. Yet, even as the gardens decayed, the Alhambra remained a symbol of the past, a reminder of the splendor of the Muslim Empire in Spain. But despite the decline, these water gardens were far from forgotten. Over the centuries, the allure of Moorish Spain's gardens never truly disappeared from the cultural imagination. Artists, poets, and architects would often look back on the glory of Al-Andalus and its gardens with a sense of longing and awe. The gardens were a symbol of an age of refinement and peace, and as such, they continued to captivate those who came after them. It wasn't until the 19th century that the gardens of Moorish Spain truly began to be rediscovered. As Romanticism swept through Europe, there was a renewed interest in the exotic, the mysterious, and the ancient. Writers and intellectuals, particularly in Spain, began to look back with reverence at the period of Muslim rule. The Alhambra, once forgotten or left to decay, became a focal point of this revival. Spanish intellectuals and historians began to appreciate the extraordinary nature of the Moorish gardens, recognizing them as masterpieces of both art and engineering. The revival of interest led to a number of restoration projects aimed at bringing the gardens back to life. In some cases, the original designs were followed as closely as possible, while in others, architects took liberties trying to recapture the spirit of the gardens rather than their exact form. Perhaps one of the most significant restoration efforts took place at the Alhambra itself. Starting in the 19th century, various Spanish and European architects and historians began to painstakingly restore the water gardens to their former glory. The intricate system of fountains, channels, and pools was slowly rebuilt, using whatever historical records and surviving remains could be found. While some of the original materials had long since vanished, the effort was an attempt to revive the atmosphere of serenity and beauty that the Moors had created centuries earlier. As the restoration progressed, the significance of these gardens as cultural and architectural landmarks became more apparent. The Alhambra's gardens, once again filled with the sound of water, became an international symbol of Islamic art and culture. The Alhambra, with its delicate arches, tilework, and water features, was seen as a reminder of a time when the Islamic world had flourished in Spain. The gardens were, in a sense, reborn, and with their rebirth came a renewed appreciation for the genius of the Moorish designers who had created them. This period of rediscovery and restoration wasn't confined to the Alhambra. Other Moorish gardens, like those at the Royal Alhambra of Seville, also saw restoration efforts in the 19th and 20th centuries. In these places, architects and gardeners took inspiration from the surviving features and the records left behind, striving to recreate the magic of the past. The revival of these gardens wasn't just about nostalgia. It was an attempt to reconnect with a lost cultural heritage, to recover a piece of history that had long been overshadowed by the upheavals of the Reconquista and the centuries that followed. One of the more fascinating aspects of this revival was how it connected to broader cultural movements in Europe and the Middle East. As Europe became more interested in Orientalism, the fascination with the cultures and art of the East, Moorish architecture and garden design came to be seen as part of a wider artistic and intellectual movement. The fascination with the exotic led to a deeper appreciation for the intricate designs of Moorish Spain, and in particular for the role of water in those designs. This movement also coincided with a growing interest in historical preservation. As the modern world rapidly industrialized and cities grew, there was a sense of urgency in preserving the past. The restoration of Moorish water gardens became part of a broader effort to safeguard architectural and cultural landmarks from the encroaching forces of time and development. These gardens were seen not just as beautiful relics, but as tangible links to a rich and vibrant history that deserved to be remembered. And so, in the modern era, the water gardens of Moorish Spain found a new life. Visitors from around the world, drawn by their beauty and history, began to flock to the Alhambra, the Alcazar, and other restored sites. The soothing sounds of water flowing through channels and fountains became a reminder of the splendor of a time long past. The gardens, once abandoned and forgotten, were now celebrated as masterpieces of both design and history. Today, these water gardens continue to captivate. The Alhambra, with its tranquil pools and delicate fountains, remains one of the most visited historical sites in the world, attracting millions of visitors every year. The legacy of the Moors, as expressed through their mastery of water and garden design, has endured for over 1,000 years. Their vision, which began in the arid landscapes of Al-Andalus, lives on in the serene, peaceful gardens that continue to be admired and enjoyed by people from all walks of life. The beauty of these gardens lies not just in their visual splendor, but in the lasting impact they've had on garden design and cultural heritage. The Moors understood that water, in all its forms, is a powerful force. It is life-giving, calming, and beautiful. Through their gardens, they created spaces that not only reflected their cultural values, but also touched the hearts of those who experienced them, whether they were rulers, courtiers, or travelers from distant lands. The legacy of the Moorish water gardens is at its heart, a legacy of peace, a quiet, flowing reminder that sometimes the most powerful things in life are the simplest: water, beauty, and tranquility. In the quiet elegance of the Moorish water gardens, we find something timeless, a calm that transcends the centuries. These gardens, where water flows like a gentle lullaby and fountains whisper their soothing tunes, continue to draw people from all over the world, each visitor seeking a glimpse of the peaceful paradise once dreamed into existence by the Moors. But what makes these gardens so enduring? What is it about the dance of water, the play of light across a reflective pool, that holds such a universal allure, even in a world far removed from the era in which they were first created? Part of the answer lies in the profound connection between nature and architecture that the Moors managed to achieve. They didn't simply carve out ornamental gardens. They shaped environments where the lines between the built world and the natural world blurred, where the two coexisted in perfect harmony. In these gardens, water wasn't just an aesthetic element, it was an integral part of the design, the lifeblood that sustained both the plants and the emotional well-being of those who visited. The Moors were true masters of environmental integration, understanding that the surrounding landscape should feel just as much a part of the garden as the carefully arranged fountains and reflecting pools. And that integration, that seamless blending of the human and the natural, is what still captivates people today. But the garden's allure is also deeply rooted in their symbolism. Water for the Moors was not just a practical necessity, it was a representation of life itself. The Quran describes paradise as a garden with rivers flowing beneath it, and so the idea of using water to create earthly paradises was inextricably tied to religious belief. In the arid landscape of Andalusia, where water was scarce and life could be difficult, the presence of water in the garden was not just a luxury, it was a divine gift. The idea that water could be harnessed, controlled and directed to create such lush beauty spoke to the Moors' deep connection to both the material and the spiritual worlds. This spiritual dimension of the gardens was, of course, felt by the rulers who retreated to these spaces. As much as the gardens were about displaying power and wealth, they were also places of meditation and reflection. The rulers of Al-Andalus, with their complex political machinations and endless demands of court life, likely found solace in the quiet, restorative ambiance of their gardens. Here, where the sound of the water trickled through channels and fountains, they could experience a moment of peace and retreat, a reminder of the simpler, purer things in life. And perhaps it's this quiet, peaceful aspect of the gardens that resonates with visitors to this day, an unspoken invitation to pause, to slow down, and to reflect on the world around us. The fascination with these gardens also speaks to a broader human desire for beauty and order. The Moors, with their mastery of symmetry and design, created gardens where every element had its place. The pools were positioned to reflect the sky, the fountains designed to pour their water in perfect patterns, the trees and flowers carefully arranged to complement the water's movement. There's something universally comforting in the sense that order can exist in nature, that the chaos of life can be organized into something peaceful and serene. In a world that often feels unpredictable and overwhelming, the orderly beauty of a garden where everything flows in harmony offers a rare sense of control, a reminder that sometimes things can work the way they were meant to. In addition to the physical beauty of these gardens, their architectural ingenuity continues to impress. The complex systems of irrigation, the clever use of gravity to move water over long distances, the intricate designs of the fountains, all of these speak to a high level of engineering skill. The Moors, who were known for their intellectual curiosity and scientific prowess, understood the principles of hydraulics and incorporated them into their gardens in ways that were both practical and artistic. The very fact that many of these gardens, despite centuries of neglect, still hold up as architectural marvels is a testament to their durability and the genius of the original designers. For those lucky enough to experience the gardens firsthand, there is a sense of stepping into a different world. Visitors walk the same paths once traversed by rulers and courtiers, their footsteps echoing in the quiet spaces between the fountains. The sound of the water, whether gentle or more pronounced, fills the air with a sense of calm. The landscape, with its carefully curated greenery and elegant tilework, transports visitors to another time, a time when beauty and tranquility were not just aspirations, but realities. And in those moments, standing beside a peaceful pool or gazing at a fountain's graceful movement, the complexities of the modern world fade away. The allure of these gardens isn't confined to their physical beauty or their historical significance. It lies, in many ways, in the idea of paradise they evoke. These gardens, after all, were designed to represent something greater, a slice of heaven, a glimpse of divine serenity. For the Moors, creating these spaces wasn't just about making a beautiful garden. It was about crafting an environment that could bring people closer to the divine, to a higher state of being. And though the religious context may have shifted over time, The idea that a garden can offer a place of peace, respite, and reflection remains as powerful as ever. Moreover, the legacy of these gardens isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a living, breathing part of the landscape. Every year, millions of people visit the Alhambra, the Alcazar, and other sites where the legacy of Moorish water gardens lives on. In these places, the past and the present coexist, and the gardens continue to offer that same sense of wonder and tranquility they did when they were first built. As visitors wander the paths and sit beside the fountains, they too become part of the ongoing story of these gardens, a story that stretches back over 1,000 years and continues to captivate the human imagination. And so, the legacy of the Moorish water gardens endures. It endures not just in the physical remnants that have survived the centuries, but in the idea of these gardens as sanctuaries of peace, beauty, and reflection. They remind us, in a world that often feels rushed and chaotic, of the power of stillness, of water, of nature, and of the human ability to create spaces of profound serenity. The Moors, through their mastery of water, have left us with a gift that continues to inspire and soothe, offering us a piece of paradise, even if only for a brief moment. Every chapter leaves a trace, and those traces twist into the next story, sharper, stranger, and pulling us deeper than before. The past doesn't rest, and neither will we. This is the Nightwatch of medieval London. Shadows, curfews, and city secret. The history of medieval London is one marked by shadows, both literal and figurative. In an age when the city had no streetlights, when most homes and businesses shut their doors at night, and when every corner seemed to harbor secrets, the dark hours of the evening posed a unique set of challenges. These challenges didn't go unnoticed, and by the time the 13th century rolled around, London found itself in need of an organized system to protect its citizens after the sun dipped below the horizon. Thus, the concept of the Nightwatch began to emerge, and with it, a new chapter in the city's history. London, like most medieval cities, was a bustling and chaotic place by day, with merchants selling their wares, artisans plying their trades, and people from all walks of life going about their business. But once night fell, the city underwent a dramatic transformation. The cobbled streets, darkened by the absence of artificial light, seemed to swallow the sounds of footsteps. Without the glow of gas lamps or the reassuring hum of distant conversations, the night was a time of eerie stillness, occasionally punctuated by the sounds of carts creaking down empty streets, or a shout echoing in the alleyways. It was a time when crime could flourish, and when the fears of the unknown became a tangible threat. This growing sense of danger wasn't without cause. Medieval London, though far from the chaotic murder holes of fiction, still had its share of risks. Thieves, burglars, and highwaymen would often take advantage of the cover of darkness to carry out their crimes. Street brawls, sometimes fueled by alcohol or personal grievances, could spill into the night, with no clear end in sight. And then, of course, there were the more sinister figures, the mysterious figures lurking in shadowy corners, waiting for the unwary to pass by. It wasn't long before the need for some kind of formal, organized protection during these hours became clear. The Nightwatch would become the answer to this need. A group of volunteers tasked with patrolling the streets of London after dusk. But this wasn't a job for just anyone. The men who took on the role of the Nightwatch had to be vigilant, tough, and above all, able to face down the fear and uncertainty that the night often brought. The origins of this early system of nighttime patrols can be traced back to the 13th century. By this time, London had already begun to grow into the city we recognize today. The population was expanding, and the streets were becoming more crowded. With that growth came the inevitable rise in crime and unrest. The wealthy merchant class, who were the lifeblood of the city, found themselves increasingly worried about the security of their homes and businesses. In response, city officials began to formalize a system for keeping watch over the streets at night. The role of the night watchman was born from this need. Initially, the night watch consisted of a mix of local residents, including members of the merchant class, tradesmen, and even some of the more established aristocracy. Their job was simple yet essential: patrol the streets after dark, keep an eye out for criminal activity, and ensure that the city remained as safe as possible through the long, often terrifying hours of night. But the task wasn't always as straightforward as it might sound. First, there was the issue of the sheer size of London itself. The medieval city was spread out, with narrow, twisting streets and alleys, each one potentially hiding trouble. The night watchman had to cover vast areas, with little more than a torch or a lantern to guide their way. The nights were long, especially during the winter months, when darkness could fall as early as 3:30 in the afternoon and last until after 8 harrowed the next morning. The idea of pacing the cold, dark streets in search of trouble was enough to make even the most hardened souls shiver. Yet, despite the challenges, these men, often chosen for their physical strength, their ability to navigate the city, and their willingness to stand watch during the witching hours, were crucial to maintaining any semblance of order in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The role of the night watch was defined by certain duties and expectations. They were tasked with a range of responsibilities, ensuring that curfew laws were observed, preventing crimes like burglary and theft, and watching for any signs of unrest. They would patrol the streets, particularly in areas prone to trouble, like near the gates or the docks, where the night was a time of transition between the safety of the city and the lawlessness of the countryside. Curfew was an important aspect of their work. As night fell, a bell would often ring from the church tower, signaling that it was time for the city to settle down. Those who were still out after the bell had sounded could be subject to punishment. Some were fined, others could be placed in the stocks or face imprisonment for a night. This system, which might seem harsh by modern standards, was designed to maintain a certain level of order, making it easier for the night watch to patrol without being overwhelmed by the number of people on the streets. At its core, the work of the night watchman was about more than just keeping criminals at bay. It was also about preserving the peace and maintaining the social order. Medieval London was a city built on a complex web of relationships between the rich and poor, the powerful and the powerless, and any disruption of this balance could have wide-reaching consequences. The night watch, as the enforcers of curfew laws and keepers of the peace, played an essential role in maintaining the social fabric that held the city together. Still, despite their importance, the night watch were not always seen in the most favorable light. Often made up of men with limited options, their role was not particularly glamorous. Many of the night watchmen were likely rough, somewhat unkempt figures who had few other prospects for employment. Some were even recruited from the ranks of the poor and destitute. While some night watchmen took their jobs seriously, others might have been more interested in the occasional drink or a little bit of mischief, rather than keeping the streets safe. The duties of the night watchman, while relatively simple, were carried out in the midst of considerable uncertainty. The shadows of the city, combined with the natural suspicion of strangers and the quiet menace of the night, created a perfect environment for the night watch to encounter not only thieves and miscreants, but also the darker fears of the human psyche. The sight of a lone figure walking through the night, lantern in hand, could feel like a haunting spectre to those who heard the footsteps echo through the empty streets. But despite the eerie nature of the job, the night watchmen were integral to maintaining a sense of order in a city that had, in many ways, been shaped by its relationship with the night. In the end, the history of the Nightwatch in medieval London is as much about the city's struggle with the night itself, its unknowns, its secrets, and its dangers, as it is about the men who tried, often at great personal cost, to keep it in check. As the night watchmen began to establish themselves as a constant presence on the streets of medieval London, their duties became more defined, and the ways in which they interacted with the city's social fabric evolved. Theirs was a job built on routine, but within that routine lay a wealth of city secrets, hidden corners, whispered rumors, and the occasional glimpse of something that would be better left unseen. Their primary responsibility remained simple: keep the city safe from criminals and maintain order as best they could under the cover of night. But this broad duty involved an intricate web of tasks that at times could feel like a never-ending series of small, mundane chores mixed with the occasional burst of adrenaline when something sinister emerged from the shadows. The patrols themselves were methodical. Night watchmen would usually pair off in groups, patrolling the winding, narrow streets of the city. London's streets full of twists and turns, narrow alleys, and dark corners were perfect places for crime to lurk unnoticed. The watchman's presence, while not a perfect deterrent, was enough to ensure that most criminals, at least the ones who had any sense, thought twice before acting under the moonlight. But patrolling wasn't just about looking for thieves or brawls. One of the night watchman's lesser-known tasks was ensuring that the night's curfew was obeyed. As dusk fell, the bell from the church towers would toll, signaling to the city that the hours of nighttime had begun, and that the streets were now the domain of the watch. People who were still out after the bell would be questioned, and if they had no legitimate reason for being outside, subjected to punishment. Of course, the curfew wasn't just about limiting crime, it was also a way of controlling the social order. The curfew ensured that only those with clear business would be seen in the streets during the darkest hours. London, in the medieval period, was still a place where the division between the classes was very pronounced, and the streets at night were, for some, a space of mystery and sometimes danger. The curfew was as much about maintaining a social order as it was about controlling crime. In addition to curfew enforcement, the night watch was responsible for a variety of smaller duties that would have gone largely unnoticed by the average citizen, but were essential in keeping the peace. For example, they were responsible for ensuring that certain activities, particularly those that could cause public disorder, didn't spill over into the nighttime hours. Activities like brewing ale, a popular but often disruptive practice, would need to be kept under control. The night watchman would wander past taverns, listening for any loud arguments or disorderly behavior. If the mood was rowdy, they had the authority to either break up a fight or warn the tavern owner about maintaining decorum. The most unsettling of their duties, however, was perhaps the role they played in uncovering and dealing with the city's more disturbing secrets. As the watchmen walked the darkened streets, they would occasionally come across scenes that suggested more than petty theft or drunken fights. Strange happenings, odd gatherings, and at times, whispers of something more sinister. There were, after all, no formal police forces to investigate these oddities in detail, and it was often the night watch who had to make judgments about whether something was simply a misunderstanding or a deeper threat to the city's safety. One such instance, though rare, involved the discovery of unusual groups meeting in the shadows. With the city's population growing, so did the number of factions within the community: guilds, merchants, political agitators, And even those with less savory intentions, the night watchmen, with their constant surveillance of the streets, were often the first to overhear strange conversations or witness secretive meetings. These could range from harmless political schemes or underground business dealings to the more unsettling conspiracies that could tear at the fabric of the city's social order. There were also the rumors of witchcraft. Witch hunts were a relatively common occurrence in medieval Europe, and London was no exception. In the dead of night, strange figures could be seen performing rituals in forgotten corners of the city, often near cemeteries or other isolated spots. The night watchman's job in these cases was often more complicated than just dealing with a group of thieves. Sometimes they would find themselves at the center of public fear and superstition, having to make decisions based on what they heard and saw, often without much formal training or support. They might have suspected that something was amiss, but many of these men were simple workers, tasked with keeping the streets safe, not with investigating the supernatural. But the secrets they uncovered were not always dark or sinister. The night also held moments of unexpected kindness, brief instances of humanity in an otherwise harsh world. The night watchman would occasionally stumble upon a street vendor who had been left stranded, a merchant with a cart broken down in the middle of the street, or a family struggling to carry a heavy load. These moments, though small in the grand scale of things, however, the night watchmen, as dedicated as they were often far from perfect. The tension between the city's wealthier class and the poor could sometimes find its way into the streets. Each night, they remained on the streets, ever vigilant, doing their best to keep the shadows at bay, often confronting the city's darkest fears and its brightest hopes, all without so much as a thank you. They were the unsung guardians of the dark hours, their names never etched in history, but their work woven into the very fabric of the city's survival. While the role of the night watchman may have been somewhat ambiguous and thankless, their success or failure depended on the tools they carried, the strategies they used, and their ability to adapt to the unpredictability of the dark city streets. One of the most iconic tools of the night watch was the lantern. In a city where night meant near total darkness, the lantern was their lifeline, a small flame contained in a metal frame that would cast light on the streets, enough to make their presence known and to give them the ability to spot potential trouble from a distance. These lanterns were far from reliable by modern standards. The wind could extinguish the flame with a gust, and the light they offered was faint at best. Still, they served their purpose, providing a semblance of security and offering enough light to make the watchmen visible to anyone who might be lurking in the shadows. Along with their lanterns, the night watchmen often carried a staff or a simple club. These were primarily for self-defense tools to protect themselves in case of a confrontation. While medieval London wasn't exactly rife with armed criminal bands, there were certainly enough unsavory figures lurking in the streets at night to make the night watchmen cautious. They had to be prepared for anything: an angry drunkard looking to pick a fight, a thief who might lash out when cornered, or even a gang of ruffians causing trouble in the darker corners of the city. Their staffs, while not especially menacing, were enough to ward off an attack or to break up a small skirmish before it escalated. But perhaps the most important tool the night watchman carried wasn't something they could hold in their hands. It was the sense of authority that came with their role. The night watchmen were part of the city's established order, and this gave them a unique power in a world that was still loosely governed. While they weren't the police in the modern sense, lacking formal training, weapons, or a clear structure of hierarchy, there was still a visible presence in the city. Their mere existence was a reminder that some semblance of order was being maintained in the darkness. Still, it wasn't just their presence that kept the streets under control. The night watchmen used their position to enforce social norms, and in some cases, they became the judges of minor disputes. In a city where public order was maintained through a delicate system of informal rules and harsh punishments, the watchmen were often the first line of response. When a crime was committed, the night watchmen would either handle it themselves or alert the town officials, who might be more equipped to deal with serious offenders. But when it came to the curfew or minor infractions, the watchmen were expected to make judgment calls on the spot, using their discretion to decide whether someone was in the wrong or simply out for a late night stroll. This balance of power, however, wasn't without its problems. The lack of formal training meant that night watchmen were sometimes prone to making mistakes or being overly harsh in their enforcement of the laws. What might have been a simple misunderstanding could quickly turn into a confrontation if the night watchman was too quick to act. Corruption and bias were also present in the ranks. Some watchmen, like the common folk they were, had their own prejudices, favoring certain groups over others, or occasionally taking bribes to overlook minor infractions. Yet, despite these imperfections, the night watchmen were still an essential part of the city's efforts to keep the night from descending into complete chaos. In addition to their day-to-day tasks, the night watchmen were also responsible for more extraordinary duties. They acted as early warning systems in times of crisis, whether it was an approaching fire, an unexpected riot, or signs of a more organized criminal activity. The night watchmen were often the first to notice the threat. They would shout alarms, gather reinforcements, and alert the city's leaders to the potential danger. As the only visible representatives of the law at night, the night watchmen became key figures during times of crisis, even if their role was often to serve as messengers rather than actual peacekeepers. This use of the night watch as early responders was especially critical in the event of a fire. London, like most medieval cities, was built primarily from wood, and fires could spread with terrifying speed. The night watchmen would be responsible for patrolling the streets, watching for the telltale signs of smoke or the flickering glow of flames. Should they spot a fire, their first duty was to alert the local authorities, who would then organize firefighting efforts. While the night watchmen weren't trained firefighters, they played a crucial role in keeping the situation from escalating. It's not hard to imagine how unsettling it must have been to witness a fire in the middle of the night, flames leaping high into the air, with the entire city at risk, and the night watchmen rushing to contain the chaos. In times of danger, the tactics of the night watch became even more varied. When responding to alarms, they would quickly assess the situation and determine whether their small groups were sufficient to deal with the problem, or if they needed to rally more support. On occasions, the night watchman would call upon the community for assistance, relying on local tradesmen, neighbors, and anyone who might be able to lend a hand. This was a time when the city's social networks mattered. The night watchmen were not lone figures wandering through an isolated, impersonal city. They were part of a community, and in times of danger, that community was often called upon to help. This system of ad hoc cooperation was, in many ways, a testament to how medieval London's social fabric worked. With no central police force or modern emergency services, the night watchmen had to rely on their community's willingness to step in during times of crisis. In this respect, the night watch was as much about the relationship between the watchman and the city's residents as it was about law enforcement itself. The watchmen didn't just keep order, they fostered a certain sense of communal responsibility, a reminder that everyone from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest beggar had a part to play in maintaining the safety of the city, even in the darkest hours. Despite the challenges, the tools and tactics of the night watchman helped shape the way London navigated the complexities of the night. whether dealing with petty crime, enforcing curfews, or responding to crises. They were the first line of defense for the city, a group of volunteers who spent their nights patrolling, protecting, and keeping the shadows at bay. Though the night watchmen of medieval London were hardly glamorous figures, their presence was undeniably essential to the city's functioning after dark. But the reality of their role goes beyond their duties as simple street patrollers or enforcers of curfew. The night watchmen were deeply embedded in the social fabric of the city, influencing and being influenced by the ever-shifting relationships that defined medieval life. They existed within a world where class divisions were stark, where the law was more a set of suggestions than the firm rules we understand today, and where the line between public service and personal survival could often blur. Medieval London, like many other cities of the time, had a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were the powerful, the wealthy merchants, the aristocrats, and the church officials. These were the people who shaped the laws, who enjoyed the privileges of wealth and influence. At the bottom were the poor, the laborers, the beggars, and those without means, those who struggled to make ends meet. Often in the very shadows the night watchmen walked through. The night watchmen, as you might imagine, were far from the top of this social ladder. In fact, they were often drawn from the same working class ranks they were assigned to patrol. Many came from humble backgrounds, probably as apprentices, tradesmen, or laborers, and likely took the job out of necessity rather than a sense of noble duty. Being a night watchman wasn't particularly well paid, nor was it regarded as a prestigious post. It was more a matter of civic duty, or for some, a means of securing at least a modicum of respect in the eyes of their neighbors. But despite their relatively low social standing, the night watchmen held a certain level of authority, at least on the streets. In their small way, they embodied the power of the state. However rudimentary that power might have been in medieval times, they were often the first line of enforcement when it came to crimes. No matter how minor, they were the face of the law, but their personal status and upbringing likely colored how they interacted with the various members of society. The night watchman's relationship with the wealthier classes was predictably complicated. On the one hand, they were there to protect the city's wealthy elite, keeping the streets clear of thieves, ensuring the curfew laws were enforced, and helping to preserve the social order. But on the other hand, many night watchmen would have had personal connections to the poorer, working-class citizens. They lived in the same neighborhoods, shopped at the same markets, and probably even drank at the same tavern. As a result, they were often caught in the middle of the class divide, trying to do their job while navigating the complex web of loyalties, alliances, and conflicts that existed between the classes. This social dynamic likely made the night watch a difficult position to hold. As much as the night watchmen were expected to enforce the law and keep the peace, they were also individuals living within the same societal structures they were meant to uphold. It's not hard to imagine that there were moments when a night watchman, with his rough background, might hesitate to enforce a rule against a fellow laborer or artisan who had fallen on hard times. Similarly, when dealing with the wealthy merchant class, the night watchman may have found himself walking a fine line, trying to respect his higher status neighbors while also grappling with his own frustrations about the inequality that existed within the city. At times, the class tensions in medieval London were evident on the streets, and the night watchmen were often caught in the crossfire. A brawl between two street vendors might be nothing more than a brief dust-up, but it could quickly escalate into something more significant if the watchmen weren't careful. Similarly, an argument between two members of the merchant class might feel like a petty dispute to one night watchman, but to another it could represent a greater clash between the city's power dynamics. Regardless of the situation, the watchmen were expected to maintain order without drawing attention to the deeper rifts beneath the surface. The role of the night watchman also intersected with religious and moral issues, which were critical to medieval society. The church was one of the most powerful institutions in the city, and the clergy had their own vision of what constituted good behavior. The night watchmen, as agents of the city's secular laws, often found themselves in the uncomfortable position of enforcing curfews or preventing certain behaviors that might be frowned upon by the church. For example, drinking, gambling, and public brawling were considered sinful activities by the church, yet they were all common in the taverns and streets after dark. On the other hand, the night watchmen were often expected to be enforcers of public morality, whether that meant keeping taverns quiet after curfew or preventing street fights. They had to be moral arbiters of sorts, though they often lacked the education or formal training to make nuanced decisions about right and wrong. It's likely that their personal beliefs about morality sometimes clashed with their duties, particularly when it came to enforcing the curfew, which was both a social and religious construct. To be found outside after curfew was not just a crime, it was a violation of societal norms, and by extension a sin. Yet, despite the murky moral waters in which they often found themselves, the night watchmen played a crucial role in reinforcing the idea of civic responsibility. Their work, in a sense, was a reminder to the people of London that everyone had a part to play in maintaining order, whether that meant patrolling the streets, obeying the curfew, or ensuring that the general sense of law and decency was upheld. It was a shared responsibility, and the night watchmen, though not always ideal figures, were essential to ensuring that this system functioned, albeit imperfectly. For the common folk, the night watchmen represented the city's attempt to maintain order in the face of often overwhelming chaos. While the upper classes could afford the luxury of private guards and personal security, the rest of the city had to rely on the watchmen to keep things from falling apart. To the lower classes, the night watchmen might have been seen as both protectors and enforcers of the status quo, individuals who could be trusted to uphold the law, but who were also part of a larger system that often made life harder for those struggling to survive. Despite the imperfections, the night watchmen were a cornerstone of medieval London's social structure. They were a visible reminder of the city's tenuous balance between order and chaos, between the law-abiding and the lawless, and between the wealthy elite and the working poor. The role they played wasn't glamorous, but it was indispensable. They might not have been heroes, but in a city defined by shadows, they were the ones who stood between the public and the night's more sinister possibilities. As the centuries passed, the role of the night watchman gradually began to fade from the streets of London. The medieval world, with its rough and rudimentary systems of law enforcement, slowly gave way to a more structured society, where the need for ad hoc nighttime patrols became less urgent. By the early modern period, the night watchman's role had become obsolete, replaced by more formalized policing systems. Yet, the impact of the night watchman on the city's social fabric and its evolving law enforcement legacy cannot be overstated. The gradual decline of the night watch began in the 16th and 17th centuries, as London grew larger and more complex, with the expansion of the city's population and infrastructure. The old systems of self-policing and voluntary service were no longer enough to manage the rising urbanization. The need for organized professional police forces became increasingly apparent. The shift toward these formalized systems, more bureaucratic, with appointed officers and established procedures, meant that the night watch, which had once been a community-driven service, could no longer keep pace with the demands of a rapidly changing city. In 1829, the establishment of the Metropolitan Police by Sir Robert Peel marked the beginning of modern policing in London. This new professional police force rendered the night watch obsolete, as their responsibilities were taken over by a more centralized and efficient system. The Metropolitan Police, equipped with the power of law, formal training, and clear structures of accountability, made the night watches more informal, and decentralized methods seem outdated. The shift from a city relying on volunteers to keep the streets safe at night to a professional police force was a sign of the growing complexity of urban life and the need for more structured methods of ensuring public order. But before this transition, the role of the night watchman slowly began to evolve. By the 18th century, many night watchmen had been incorporated into a broader network of city officials and were sometimes even employed by the local government. The once independent groups of volunteers began to merge with the developing early police forces. While their duties may have remained largely the same, their position within the legal structure became more formalized. Still, they never had the same authority or influence as the officers who would follow in their stead. As London entered the 19th century, the remnants of the night watch system could still be seen in the older, informal policing structures, but their days were numbered. The rise of the professional police force marked a significant departure from the old traditions of civic responsibility and neighborhood-based watch systems. The night watchman had once represented the community's effort to maintain order, often on a shoestring budget, and with little formal authority. Their decline symbolized the shift toward a more centralized form of law enforcement, one that didn't rely on the goodwill or social ties of the people, but on an institution that stood separate from the community it served. However, despite their decline, the legacy of the night watchman endures in several ways. One of the most visible remnants is the concept of the neighborhood watch systems that exist in various forms today. While modern neighborhood watches are far more organized and formalized than the medieval night watch, they share a similar spirit of community involvement in maintaining local safety. Like the night watch, modern volunteers participate in a kind of civic duty, helping to keep their neighborhoods safe and watching for anything that might threaten the peace. The night watch also left behind a deep imprint on the city's cultural memory. In literature, art, and folklore, the figure of the night watchman has taken on a certain symbolic weight. As characters in medieval stories or historical plays, they often appear as lowly but steadfast guardians of the city, the silent sentinels who kept watch when all others had gone to bed. Their quiet vigilance has been romanticized over the centuries, making them both heroic and tragic figures, men who lived in the shadows, guarding a city that was often too busy with its own intrigues to pay attention to the ones protecting it. The image of the solitary night watchman, lantern in hand, walking the darkened streets, is a symbol of both vigilance and solitude, of the quiet sacrifices made for the sake of community. Additionally, the night watch contributed to shaping how we view authority and responsibility in urban settings. Even in their most rudimentary form, they were part of the first steps toward what we now understand as urban law enforcement. The fact that these early watchmen were essentially citizens policing their own neighborhoods laid the groundwork for the eventual professionalization of police forces. The idea that people could take responsibility for their own safety and the safety of their neighbors, even through imperfect and voluntary systems, set the stage for the creation of institutions that would one day be tasked with maintaining public order on a much larger scale. Even with the advent of more sophisticated policing systems, there's something timeless about the role of the night watchman. Their task, though no longer needed in the same way, speaks to a fundamental aspect of human life: the need for safety, for order, and for the protection of the community, especially when the world around us feels uncertain or dangerous. The job of the night watchman may have been replaced by professional police officers, but the principles of vigilance and care for the community remain relevant today. The echoes of the Nightwatch can still be heard in the quiet hours of the evening, though the streets of London are now well lit and patrolled by officers in uniform. The shadows of history linger, reminding us of a time when the city's safety rested on the shoulders of ordinary men. In the end, the Nightwatch men were a product of their time, an imperfect but vital element of a society that struggled to maintain order amidst the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. And though their time has passed, the legacy of their watchful eyes continues to inform how we think about the safety, stability, and the protection of our communities. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.